I didn't disappear all at once. It happened slowly, in small, almost polite ways. People stopped asking how I was doing. Then they stopped asking where I was going. Eventually, they stopped saying my name out loud, and I didn't correct them when they forgot it. The night I decided to let my old life die, I wasn't running from danger. I wasn't chased, threatened, or exposed. I was exhausted. Not the kind of tired sleep can fix, but the deeper kind, the one that settles into your bones and convinces you that continuing would be a greater violence than stopping. If you had met me before that night, you would have thought I was doing fine. That's the part that still makes me bitter when I think about it. From the outside, everything looked acceptable. Stable job. Clean apartment. Predictable routine. People congratulated me for making it, and I nodded as if I agreed with them. But every morning, when I opened my eyes, the first thought wasn't gratitude. It was disappointment. Not in the world, in myself. I had become a person I didn't recognize, but worse, a person I didn't even bother to question anymore. The real breaking point wasn't dramatic. It was a Tuesday. I was standing in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing my teeth, watching my own reflection perform the motions on autopilot. And suddenly I realized something terrifying: if I lived the rest of my life exactly like this, nothing would technically be wrong. No scandal. No collapse. No clear reason to leave. That was the problem. I had traded my life for safety so gradually that I didn't notice when the exchange was completed. One compromise at a time. One "I'll do it later." One "this is just how it is." Until there was nothing left to defend except the illusion of responsibility. People talk about regret as if it's loud and obvious. As if it screams at you. Mine whispered. It said, "You are wasting something irreplaceable, and you are doing it carefully." There was a secret I never told anyone. Not because it was illegal or immoral, but because it would have exposed the truth I worked so hard to bury. I hated the person I had become, and I was terrified that this version of me was permanent. I didn't want to die. I wanted to stop being seen as someone I no longer was. That's an important difference. The idea of disappearing didn't come as a plan. It arrived as relief. A strange calm that washed over me one evening while I was scrolling mindlessly through my phone, avoiding my own thoughts. For the first time in years, I imagined a version of myself without expectations attached. No history. No reputation. No one waiting for me to stay the same. The thought scared me. Then it comforted me. Then it wouldn't leave. I started noticing how tightly my life was stitched together by other people's assumptions. Family who needed me to be reliable. Colleagues who needed me to be consistent. Friends who needed me to play a familiar role so they wouldn't have to adjust their image of me. No one asked if I was still willing. I began preparing without admitting it to myself. I cleaned my apartment more thoroughly than usual, as if I were a guest checking out of a hotel. I gave away things that had once mattered to me, telling myself I was decluttering. I stopped making plans more than a few days ahead. The quietest part of my breakdown was how logical it felt. One night, lying in bed, I tried to imagine myself at 70. Same routines. Same conversations. Same suppressed questions. The image filled me with a grief so heavy I had to sit up just to breathe. That's when I understood that staying would cost me more than leaving ever could. Still, I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to go, but because disappearing felt selfish. People depend on the version of you they know. They build parts of their lives around your predictability. Walking away feels like betrayal, even when staying feels like slow self-erasure. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself everyone feels this way sometimes. I told myself to be grateful. All the responsible thoughts arrived right on time, lined up neatly like guards protecting a prison. What finally pushed me over wasn't pain, it was clarity. I realized that no one was actually asking me to stay. They were assuming I would. And I had been confusing assumption with obligation. The night I left, there were no goodbyes. I didn't write letters or dramatic messages. I packed a small bag with the essentials and left everything else behind, including proof that I had ever been more than this version of myself. As I locked the door, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, fear mixed with relief, perfectly balanced. The kind that tells you that whatever happens next will at least be real. I didn't know who I would become. I only knew who I refused to remain. And for the first time, that was enough to take the next step. The first thing I learned after leaving was how loud silence can be. When the train finally stopped and I stepped onto a platform I hadn't planned to remember, there was no revelation. No sense of rebirth. Just the cold air filling my lungs and the unsettling realization that no one in the world was expecting me anywhere. I had romanticized anonymity. I thought it would feel like freedom immediately. Instead, it felt like standing in an empty room after a party you weren't invited to but still somehow helped clean up. For the first few days, I existed on pure momentum. I walked, ate, slept, and moved again, driven by the simple fact that stopping would force me to think. And thinking was dangerous then. Thinking meant facing the question I had carefully avoided: what if disappearing doesn't fix anything without my old life pressing against me? My thoughts grew louder. Memories I had postponed came back with interest. Choices I had justified suddenly demanded explanation. I had escaped the structure of my life, but not the consequences of having lived it. There was a strange guilt that followed me everywhere. Not the sharp kind, the dull, constant pressure of knowing that somewhere, people would notice my absence eventually. They would ask questions. They would fill the silence with theories that were easier than the truth. I told myself I owed them nothing. Then I told myself that was a lie. The hardest part wasn't loneliness. It was the absence of reflection. When you leave everyone behind, there is no one to confirm that you exist. No one mirrors your expressions back to you. No one reacts. You begin to wonder whether you're still a person or just a sequence of movements. I rented a small room under a name that felt foreign in my mouth. Saying it out loud was like wearing someone else's code, functional, but never warm. Still, it served its purpose. It separated me from my past just enough to breathe. At night, I lay awake listening to unfamiliar sounds and waiting for regret to arrive fully formed. It never did. Instead, regret came in fragments. In small, cruel flashes. A shared joke I would never hear again. A familiar voice saying my name the way only one person ever had. That was when the moral weight of what I'd done finally settled in. I hadn't just left a life. I had removed myself from other people's stories without permission. And while no one owns another person, absence still creates damage. Even justified absence. The thought almost sent me back. I stood outside a cafe one morning, watching people greet each other with practiced warmth, and felt the temptation to return so strongly it made my hands shake. Going back would have been easy. Apologies. Explanations. Promises to try harder. Everyone loves a redemption arc that doesn't require change. But I knew myself too well. If I returned, I would shrink again. I would apologize for wanting more. I would resume the role that kept everyone else comfortable while quietly dissolving myself to maintain it. That realization didn't make the choice easier. It made it irreversible. I began to notice how often people choose familiarity over truth. How we cling to identities long after they stop fitting because the alternative feels like betrayal. We confuse consistency with integrity, even when consistency requires lying to ourselves. I wasn't brave. I was cornered. With no audience, I started paying attention to the small details I had ignored for years. The way my shoulders finally relaxed when no one was watching. The way my thoughts slowed down without constant performance. The strange pleasure of doing something simply because I wanted to, not because it aligned with the version of myself others expected. Still, the emptiness lingered. Reinvention is exhausting when there's nothing to build on. You don't suddenly become someone new, you become undefined. And being undefined is terrifying because it offers no script. No reassurance that you're doing life correctly. There were moments when I questioned whether I had confused discomfort with unhappiness. Whether this ache was just the natural cost of existing without distraction. Maybe this was what everyone felt, and I had simply lost my tolerance for it. One night, sitting alone in a dim room, I finally allowed myself to ask the question I had avoided since leaving: what if the problem wasn't my life, but my refusal to accept it? The answer didn't come quickly or kindly. I realized that my old life wasn't wrong. It just wasn't mine anymore. And staying would have been a lie, a quiet one, but a corrosive one. There is a special kind of grief reserved for lives that almost felt right. Not bad enough to escape easily. Not good enough to stay without regret. That was the space I had lived in for years, convincing myself that endurance was a virtue. Here's the truth no one tells you: endurance becomes cowardice when it replaces honesty. I had endured long enough. The days passed. Slowly. Uneventfully. And in that uneventfulness, something unexpected happened. The constant inner noise, the self-criticism, the comparison, the rehearsed explanations began to fade. Not disappear, but loosen their grip. I started to feel moments of neutrality. Not happiness. Just absence of tension. And that felt revolutionary. For the first time, my thoughts weren't rushing toward the future or clinging to the past. They existed where I was. That terrified me almost as much as it healed me. Because if this worked, if I could actually rebuild, then there would be no one left to blame for the life I created next. And that responsibility was heavier than any role I had ever played before. There is a moment, after you've been alone long enough, when you realize solitude has stopped being a punishment and started becoming a mirror. It happened to me on an ordinary afternoon. No dramatic setting. No music swelling in the background. I was sitting by a window, watching people move through their lives with purpose that looked borrowed rather than chosen. And for the first time since I left, I didn't feel separate from them. I felt honest. I wasn't happy. But I wasn't pretending either. That distinction mattered more than I expected. The idea of starting over is often sold as transformation. New habits. New confidence. A cleaner version of yourself. That's not how it works. At least, not at first. Before you can build anything, you have to sit with what's left when all the roles fall away. What was left of me wasn't impressive. I was cautious. Uncertain. Quiet in a way that came from listening instead of waiting to speak. I had spent so many years performing usefulness that I had forgotten how to exist without justification. And that scared me more than failure ever had. There were days when I questioned the ethics of my disappearance all over again. I imagined the people I left behind constructing their own narratives, filling the silence with meaning that had nothing to do with the truth. I wondered whether choosing myself had made me cruel. But then I remembered something important: I hadn't abandoned them to pursue pleasure. I had stepped away to stop lying. There is a difference. The truth is, staying would have required me to keep shrinking. To keep muting the parts of myself that didn't fit the image others relied on. Over time, that kind of self-erasure doesn't just harm you, it teaches everyone around you that you are less than you are. Leaving was the first honest thing I had done in years. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to make choices without asking permission from an imaginary audience. I chose how to spend my time without framing it as productivity. I allowed myself to want things without translating them into goals. I let boredom exist without rushing to escape it. That was harder than any responsibility I'd ever carried. Because when you stop performing, you are forced to confront the question you've been avoiding: who are you when no one is watching? The answer didn't arrive fully formed. It arrived in fragments. In small preferences. In moments of quiet certainty. In the realization that I didn't need to be exceptional to be alive. One evening, walking alone through unfamiliar streets, I felt something close to peace. Not joy. Not relief. Just alignment. As if my internal compass, broken for so long, had finally stopped spinning. I understood then that my old life hadn't failed me. I had outgrown it silently, without giving myself permission to admit it. And when growth is denied expression, it turns inward and begins to rot. Letting my old name fade wasn't about erasing the past. It was about refusing to let it dictate my future. There's a myth that we owe the world a consistent version of ourselves. That changing too much is a kind of betrayal. But consistency without integrity is just repetition. I don't know if the people I left behind ever fully understood my absence. Maybe they never will. And that's a cost I have to live with. Growth always demands payment, and sometimes the currency is misunderstanding. What I know is this: I stopped confusing survival with living. I stopped calling endurance a virtue when it was really fear in disguise. I stopped waiting for permission to become someone else. I didn't reinvent myself. I allowed myself to be unfinished. And in that unfinished state, I found something I had been missing all along: agency. The quiet power of choosing without applause. Of existing without explanation. If there's one truth I carry with me now, it's this: you don't have to destroy your life to leave it behind. Sometimes you just have to stop feeding the version of yourself that no longer reflects who you are. I let my name die not because I hated who I was but because I respected who I could become, and for the first time, that future felt like something I was finally allowed to meet.